And let me make an introduction. My name is Chris Chappell, and I'm Joshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology at Loyola Marymount University, the founding director of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And when we look at the launch of the Yoga Studies Yoga Philosophy Certificate Program in 2002, we're experiencing a 20th anniversary of doing this work. And we are very, very happy this evening to welcome really quite a robust crowd. And I want to say a shout out to Itmar Theodore, and he is in Israel as best I can guess. And I want to also say hello to Patrick, who is such a mainstay for our work here going back long before Yoga Philosophy Certificate, and so many others, alumni, friends, and just a beautiful array of names and people here. So I want to introduce Professor Edwin Bryant, and like I often will do, just a little bit of a narrative that we were in the same time at the same place, the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University, during the conception and the launch of the series of conferences on world religions and ecology. And Edwin was in residence at Harvard, I believe finishing up at Columbia. And through these many years, we've stayed in touch, and he has done prodigious work. He's lectured live bodily at Loyola Marymount several times, including a conference that we did on the Indus Valley civilization controversies, talking from a very important early book he wrote, The Surveys, the debate over invasion, incursion, all manner of things. He was also part of our broad discussion on the Yoga Sutra. And he did a wonderful study that gives in synopsis form the various commentaries on Patanjali. He also has done remarkable published work and presentation work on the Bhagavata Purana, and out of and within his devotional tradition of the Vaishnava aspect of religiosity within India. And he has been a very sought after, popular teacher for yoga alliance trainings, many of the teacher trainings done at studios really all throughout the country. And for many years now, he's been at Rutgers University. And I was so happy to hear years ago that that position had been created. Rutgers did not have a history of really things India. And I'm glad to see that that has been corrected. And now he actually has colleagues there at Rutgers with whom he is able to work. And we're just thrilled that he has chosen to be with us tonight. And I know that it's late there. I apologize for now having gone global. We have to take all sorts of factors into account. I also want to welcome Stoma onto the screen. And the last time I saw Stoma was just before we had the close down in 2019. We had a lovely dinner together in Haskas Village as we were participating in a conference on meditation at the IIT in Delhi. So Edwin, welcome, and we look forward to your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Professor Chappell, for this opportunity to address your community. And I hope you all know how fortunate you are to have Professor Chappell as your steward and guardian in the study of yoga. Actually opened up the study of yoga in academia. I remember when I started my studies, I mean, I don't know, I was in the closet, and most people seem to have been. But Professor Chappell has sort of brought the yoga studies, created this wonderful program, that you have in LMU, and I send my own students there, even though we have our own master's program. If they're really serious about yoga, I send them. I encourage them to look into to working with Professor Chappell. Also, Professor Chappell was instrumental in creating a rubric for yoga in the American Academy of Religion. So he's really been at the forefront of modern yoga studies. So it's an honor to be a part of that today. So, gosh, the Indo-Aryan, you reminded me of 20 years ago. It's hard for me to recreate my mindset when I was so into this Indo-Aryan thing. And now I look back and say, well, what was all that about? Why didn't I do a degree? Why didn't I study Vedanta Sutra or something? But anyway, these are the gunas, ever-changing. And yes, it's true. My first work was with the Indo-Aryans. And yeah, I forgot all about that conference in LMU. So our topic today is going to be, we're going to have a quick glance at Isvara in yoga. And we're going to start off assuming that most of you are fairly well grounded in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So we're going to start off having a quite focused look at the Isvara verses. There's probably 7 or 8 of them, perhaps 9 or so, and just in isolation. And then we're going to piggyback off of that into the text that I've spent much of my life studying, the Bhagavata Purana, except for that bizarre 7 years when I was doing the Indo-Aryans. I somehow sidetracked or hijacked by, well, actually that was connected. I was connected because I'd spent many years in India, and I basically was groomed in traditional ways of thinking about history. And then when I first came to academia, there was this whole archaeology and linguistics and Indo-Aryan invasion, and I wasn't quite sure how to have the two models communicate. There was any space for communication. So that's actually really why I undertook that. In fact, that dissertation was supposed to be the first chapter in what my original dissertation was, in quest of the historical Krishna. So it was meant to sort of follow in the footsteps of the quest of the historical Jesus. And the Indo-Aryan thing was supposed to be the first chapter. And then that just took an enormous life of its own. And next thing I knew. Anyway, enough of all of that. And so we're going to be reading verses together. Like that's really my own method of pedagogy, to try to get as close as we can to the texts, hug the texts, and then use those as a springboard for conversation. So we're going to look at the Isvara verses of Patanjali, and then we're going to look at Ashtanga Yoga, that specific Chitta Vritti Nirodha, what most traditions would call dhyana, that practice in the Bhagavata. That may not be the primary, well, it certainly isn't the primary practice of the Bhagavata Purana, which is a much more, Bhakti oriented, where the mind is more flowing, focused on Bhagavan, but in a more flowing sort of way. So we will be looking at verses that are not representative of the Bhagavatam necessarily, but the Ashtanga, but they overlap with Patanjali. So they make a nice connection, a nice bridge between the Yoga Sutras. And in the course of doing that, we'll say something about Vedanta as we advertise. We've already got an hour. We've already lost 10 minutes. But something about Vedanta, something about the Isvara, sa-Isvara, nir-Isvara possibilities within Vedanta. Then we'll say something about other forms of Isvara. Okay, let's kick off with Patanjali. Can you all see the screen? Everybody?
All good.
Right. So we all know, I'm assuming that we all know what the definition of yoga is in Patanjali. I'm sure Professor Chappell has studied this with most of you. Otherwise, we're going to have to take away your accreditation, Professor Chappell. But we all know that in Patanjali, what is yoga? It is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. It's a practice involving the Nirodha. And that there's a typo here. There should be an H with a dot under it, Nirodha. That is the stilling of all states of mind. And why would anybody possibly want to do that? Tada kim bhavati, what happens then? Drashtuhu svarupe vasthanam. There is literally the situatedness in its own nature of the seer. Okay, and notice Patanjali is using the term seer rather than Atman or Purusha, because he wants to stress the fact, if you just say it's the Atman or the Purusha, well, that doesn't tell you anything. You know, it could be a clod of earth or anything. But when you use a word like of the seer, then you know that entity is seeing in the sense of consciousness. So there is the situatedness. In English we might say the seer abides it. Now the point is Svarupa, in its own nature. Okay, we're going to contrast this with Bhakti, where the Bhakta seeks to be absorbed in the Rupa, the form, not Sva, of oneself, but Bhagavan's Rupa. And we're going to, and so I want to make let's make a nice, samskara of that in our minds. The difference, Sva means one's own. Rupa is, form, essence. So the goal of yoga is Patanjalian yoga is for the seer to be immersed in Sva, in its nature. We're going to contrast that with when we engage the Bhagavatam with the goal there, which is being absorbed in the nature of Bhagavan. As all of you know, that's the word for Isvara, Bhagavan, essentially the same term. Okay, so that's the goal of yoga, and of course, if one is not absorbed in one's own nature, consciousness being eternal, you can't switch it off. It's got to be conscious of something. So it's not conscious of itself. What is it? Itaratra at other times. What is it doing? Vritti sarupyam. It's absorbed in the vrittis. Right. That's the goal of yoga. Okay. Drashtahu sva swarupe vasthanam. And so a little bit further on in the sutras, then we encounter Ishvara. Now, if you're going to Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the mind has to be nirodha on something. Patanjali is going to call it a lambana, right? The mind is not. This is not mindfulness. Don't confuse this with mindfulness meditation, which comes out of the Buddhist tradition, and some differences about how old it is, how far back it goes, because a lot of old Buddhist meditation is actually dhyana. It's also Chitta Vritti Nirodha, but that's a conversation for Buddhist specialists to have. But the mind has to be fixed on something. Okay, anything that's going to be fixed, it has to be fixed on something denser than itself. And that's sort of the principle of an alambana. To support something, then the support has to be denser than the thing which is being supported. So here Patanjali says, and we won't engage the discussion of what does this Isvara refer to, but one can focus, well, literally Ishvara Pranidhana, by surrender to Ishvara. What's being surrendered? Well, obviously the mind, right? We're talking about the mind. Yoga is about the mind. It's about the chitta. So the mind then is surrendered to Ishvara. And then Patanjali sort of connects this Ishvara with the Ishvara that's perfectly well known since the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. A lot of, I have to say it, surprising scholarship been written about the Ishvara, it's Ishvara, Patanjali is not the creator God. Patanjali is not talking about creation. There's about 20, 30 words on Ishvara, and he's only introduced him in terms of how Ishvara is relevant to his project, which is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Everybody accepts that Ishvara, well, the very word Ish means to have power. Ishvara means one who has more power. What's the most powerful thing you can do is create a universe. So therefore, Ishvara, since certainly the Upanishadic period, it denotes the creator, the creator, and certainly all the commentators take that. But creation is irrelevant to Patanjali. He's talking about, he's interested in Ishvara's role in this project of Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Okay, so you can surrender the mind to Ishvara, and now before he tells you how you do that, he just connects with sort of generic, bhakti, well-worn, well-known information about Ishvara as a Purusha Vishesha, right? Is a special kind of Purusha, still a Purusha. A Purusha simply means a being made of consciousness. So you can call him a Purusha Vishesha, you can call him an Atman, Parama Atman, same sort of thing. In the Gita, Krishna says there's 2 Purushas, Dvavimo Purusho Loke, Kshara Sakshara says there's the Purushas that are liberated, there's regular Purushas, and then Purusha, Uttamam, there's a Purusha who's supreme. So whatever kind of vocabulary you want to use, Ishvara is a supreme, or here he says a special sort of Purusha. And what sort of specialness does Patanjali focus on here? Never been affected by kleshas, ignorance, karma. And so he's not a yogi, my friends, who made it, I don't know, maybe Eliade introduced this notion of some proto-yogi, or, the verse very clearly says, aparamrishta, has never been affected by samsara, essentially, right? All the commentators make a point here. He's not like the Buddha who once was in avidya, in ignorance, and then sort of became enlightened. He's not like Kapila. They even mentioned Kapila, we're going to turn to next. He's not like Kapila, and probably they have the Shvetara Kapila in mind, who receives instruction from Shiva. Not like that. Why is he not like that? Never been aparamrishtaha, very important. Never been affected by the kleshas. Let's just go with ignorance as the primary klesha, the field of the others, right? Kshetra mutaresha. So he's a special sort of Ishvara entity, and why does he need to be special? Because you're going to fix your mind on him. No good fixing your mind on, Joe Blow. That's not going to help you attain samadhi. So you need some kind of if you're going to focus your mind on a being or an entity, it has to be put vishesha, insofar as we'll see later on, Ishvara can bestow samadhi. So he's never been affected, and he's supremely omniscient. Because there's going to be a lot of talk in the 3rd, 4th chapter about how yogis can become omniscient when they bypass the ahankara, the kleshas, the ahankara, the conditionings of karma, which limit consciousness. They can actually, their claims are going to be quite grandiose claims that we're going to find in chapter 3, chapter 4. The yogi's consciousness and mind, for that matter, and chitta, can pervade the whole universe, from an anu to the mahatattva. So that's a kind of omniscience. If your consciousness, what your consciousness pervades. So if your consciousness pervades the whole universe, then you're omniscient. But Ishvara's omniscience is different from that. It's greater still. So he's not, again, same point being made as up in 24. He is not some kind of a liberated yogi or some kind of an accomplished siddha. Okay, and he's the guru of the ancients. For whatever reason, Patanjali, meaning that he's an Ishvara, but he's connected with us, with the beings in samsara, and he can be the guru of the ancients because he's not affected by time. So here again, a transcendence. Patanjali doesn't give us any information about where Ishvara resides. Where does he exist? But if he's not affected by time, then he's not in Prakriti, because everything in Prakriti is affected by time. We need to, there's so few words here, so minimalistic, but there's enough for us to get a pretty clear idea that this is the Ishvara that everybody talks about, that the Moksha Dharma talks about, that the Gita talks about. And I'm, find it a little surprising that scholars try to wriggle out of that. And that seems to me to be more of a psychological problem than a philological problem. Philologically, it's clear what Ishvara means in this period. So to try to wriggle out of that, it seems to be we need to be looking at psychological reasons for that, some kind of an aversion. Perhaps we're running away from the notion of God or whatever. Maybe it's not cool to be a theist these days, whatever that may be. That's a psychological problem. But the Sanskrit is pretty clear, right? Number one, never been affected by karma, not a normal Atman. His omniscience, fair enough, others can be omniscience, but nir-atishayam, not on this level, whatever that means, we can speculate, and never affected by time. So if that, it doesn't point to the supreme Ishvara that in terms of how the term is used everywhere else in Sanskrit literature at this point in time, then I think one would have to really engage in special pleading. Now, what's all this got to do with Chitta Vritti Nirodha? Well, tasya vachakaha pranava, he comes as the sound Om. What's that got to do with Chitta Vritti Nirodha? Well, the japa. Japa is a Nirodha practice, a stilling of the mind practice. So Ishvara comes in this sonic form, which of course is well known. And another reason why this is not some accomplished yogi, since the Upanishads, Om has been associated with Brahman and the absolute. So all of these 4 reasons in 4 verses, given the paucity of words here, it's quite surprising that people try to say that Ishvara is not what all the other traditions at this moment in time understand Ishvara to be. But let me not gripe on about that. So japa is a chitta-vritti nirodha practice, a stilling of the mind, and so the vachaka, which is the sound representation, and with the grammarians would say that the sound, well, they would say all words are actually sonic encapsulations of the signified. They're signifiers. They're not arbitrarily man-made or human-made or woman-made, but they are in a way they actually the actual object is inherent within the word. There are certain schools of language, the grammarians and the mimamsakas. Remember, the mimamsakas, they have an eternal Veda. They don't even believe in cyclical creation because they want to preserve the eternity of the Vedas. Well, if the Vedas are eternal, the words are eternal. If the words are eternal, their references are eternal. So anyway, we won't get into all of that, but Patanjali is coming in that line of thought where Om is Ishvara, not a representation of Ishvara. It's important. So pranu, that which pranavaha, pranu, that which emanates forth at the beginning of creation, that's Om. Okay, so Ishvara is Om, just like the Upanishads say, Brahman is Om. Again, that's another reason for connecting Ishvara and Brahman, all these reasons. And you do japa. And Tadartha Bhavana, well, we can speculate about that. The Bhaktas would say in a devotional, being aware of its meaning. Remember, you're doing chitta-vritti nirodha, so you're not sort of theorizing about the meaning. So what does this mean then? Tadartha Bhavanam. Well, certainly the later Bhakta traditions would say when you do japa, you do it in a devotional mood. It's more of a mood. It's not an active sort of, because you're nirodhering the mind, but the mind is flavored in a certain way with this submission, with this affection, really. So, but anyway, I won't press that point. Artha Bhavanam simply means, I'm bringing in some later bhakti flavors there, and it simply means with its meaning in mind. Okay, and what happens if you do that? Well, then you come pratyak chetana adhigamo, realization of this inner consciousness, the siya, the atman, the purusha. So the japa then is, notice that Patanjali puts it first on the list of alambana. You have to fix your mind on something. He does give, 5 or 6 other options. Some of them are slightly strange. And so we have a series of va, or you can fix it on, someone who's free of desire, kind of a guru figure. And we have some examples of that. For example, in the life of Muktananda, who, much of his meditation was on his guru, Nityananda. So I have examples of that. But notice how this is first on the list, and he gets 6 or 7 verses, whereas all the other vas only get 1. So clearly he's prioritizing an Ishvara type of meditation, although he's not insisting on it, which I find very elegant of Patanjali. Okay, and so from this Om, you approach the pratyak chetana adhigamaha. Adhigama, you come close to the pratyak chetana. Chetana is consciousness, right? Chitti, Shakti, Chetana, these are synonyms. Shuddhi, later on Patanjali will call it Drishimatra, consciousness. And removal of antaraya bhav, the kleshas, klesha tanukarana. Okay, so are we clear? So this is Ishvara then, and Ishvara at this point serves as the support of the mind, because you have to nirodha the mind. So you fix it on Ishvara. How are you supposed to fix it on Ishvara? You can't fix your mind on your own Atman. How are you supposed to fix it on the Supreme Atman? The mind is grosser than the Atman. It can only fix itself on something grosser than it. That's the principle. Something pervades something grosser than it. That's a Sankhya principle. So therefore, the mind cannot focus on the actual Atman. It might focus on the idea of an Atman, but not on the actual Atman. So Jnana Yoga is another path where you're sort of focusing the mind on the idea of the Atman. Bhakti, you're focusing your mind on the idea of Bhagavan as represented in the texts, and we'll get to that in a minute. So then how are you supposed to fix the mind on Ishvara? Well, that's why Ishvara comes as sound. The sound is a tanmatra, is a quality that's in Sankhya metaphysics is grosser than the manas, the chitta. And therefore the chitta can focus on the sound because it's grosser, it's denser, it's in the evolute of Sankhya. Of course, Ishvara, of course, in the Bhakti traditions, and Patanjali doesn't say this, but well, he sort of does when he talks about Vachakaha. Ishvara can pervade that sound. So a bit like fire can pervade iron. So the iron becomes fire-ized, even though it's kind of iron on one level, but on another it's fire, has all the qualities of fire. So Ishvara can pervade the sound, so the sound becomes Ishvarized, something like that. And then, but the mind can be fixed on the Om because the Om is still a sound, and in that sense is denser than the mind stuff on the Sankhya metaphysical schema. Okay, so all of that, and then finally, and what do we get from Ishvara Pranidhana, apart from alambana, apart from using Ishvara as a support for the mind? Patanjali just throws this out. But Ishvara can give you the Siddhira Samadhi, the commentators say, he can give, the Krishna says it throughout the Gita. I can give you, I could give you Samadhi. So if you want an experience of your Svarupa, of your own Atman, then Ishvara can bestow that. We'll see in the Bhagavatam, this gets rejected. This is called fake bhakti. It's actually called fake bhakti because you're approaching God for something. It's kind of like mercantile. You're not approaching God, for Bhagavan. You're approaching God to get something. So the later theologians will say there's three types of bhakti. There's the karma mishrita bhakti, jnana mishrita bhakti, and shuddha bhakti. There's the bhakti where you're asking God for material things. That's karma. It's mixed, mishrita karma, right? That's sort of like Vedic ritualism, or approaching Ishvara for, like Krishna says in the Gita, 4 types of people approach him: one who is needy, one who is in need of wealth, one who is afflicted, like that. So there's that sort of bhakti, and then there's those that approach Ishvara for Svarupa, an experience of their own Atman. That's called jnana mishrita. It's mixed with desire for moksha, jnana, which leads to moksha. So the Bhagavatam is going to consider those to be bhakti, but contrast it with pure bhakti, which is not asking. And the Bhagavatam repeatedly says the bhaktas reject moksha, reject moksha, reject moksha. The Bhagavatam even goes so far as to say moksha is hell, because in the state of Svarupa, immersed in one's own nature, one has now severed oneself from the possibility of a relationship with Bhagavan, which is the primary focus of the Bhagavata Purana. But nonetheless, I know I'm spitting out a lot of information now, but for Patanjali then, Ishvara is kind of like, can bestow Samadhi. And notice how, where is Ishvara? What dimension does he exist in? He's not in Prakriti, so clearly he's transcendent. Of course, Vaishnavas and Shaiva Siddhantins will have a lot to say about other dimensions, Brahman dimensions, but Patanjali doesn't take us there. Okay, so that is, so we use this now as a comparison, and we're going to go into the Bhagavatam because that's what I've been invited to share with you, and we'll see that the Bhagavatam allows 2 kinds of relationships with Bhagavan. One is the same as Patanjali. You focus the mind on Bhagavan, but really what you want, you're just using that as a support for the mind. And what you really want is an experience of your Svarupa, your own pure consciousness. And we're going to read a story where that is presented. But the Bhagavatam, basically, there's many ways of dividing things up, but for our purposes, let's consider 2. The Bhagavata says there's 2, actually it says there's more than 2, but we're interested in 2 different kind of goals two different kinds of ultimate yogic goals. And one is the experience of your own Atman, Patanjali called Svarupe Vasthanam, situated, discovering your own Atman. We were just reading it in Sanskrit in the Gita today. Atmani Atmana Tushtaha, that one is satisfied in the self, by the self, through the self. So there's that one, that's one goal that you can, that there is an Atman and it can be experienced. The other goal the Bhagavatam presents is that one can absorb one's consciousness in a distinct being. We can call it dualistic for now, but they would sort of resist that term. And in other words, one can attain not just as a practice, but as an ultimate goal. That this is a theistic tradition, heavily monotheistic, that God is an eternal supreme being. And therefore there's two goals then. In the Abrahamic tradition, even though, most of the Abrahamic traditions, there is a sense that there's a soul, but most of the focus is on God, on God, on God. And if you start talking, there are mystics in the Christian tradition and Islamic tradition who talk very similar to Atman seekers of the Indian traditions or the Upanishadic traditions. But for the most part, the focus is on God. And it can even be considered heretical. There's even cases of people being executed for saying, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. In Indian tradition, there's been these two paths, and they sort of coexist, overlap. They're not, overlap. Obviously, everyone accepts that there's an Atman. That's a sine qua non of the Hindu moksha traditions. Buddhism is a little bit different there, but similar in many ways. But there's also the focus on Bhagavan. Now, the role of who Bhagavan is, what is the ultimacy of Bhagavan? Is Bhagavan just a prop? Is Bhagavan right, as Patanjali is presenting Bhagavan? Is Bhagavan part of the illusory superimposition as Advaita Vedanta would have it? Or is Bhagavan an eternal being? Those kinds of issues and discussions are what divide the Vedanta sects. And we don't have much time to get into that other than mention it. What I'd like to do, though, is have a look at the Sabja Yoga, which means, the mind fixed on something. Sabija is the same as, Sabija, they're nir-bija and sabija, sampragnata samadhis, right? So Kapila, this is Kapila, who in the Bhagavatam is considered an incarnation of Vishnu. Kapila really surfaces all over the place in the ancient texts. He's in the Mahabharata as a sage, in the Shvetashvatara, he receives the teachings of Sankhya from Shiva. So he's clearly probably one of the best known sages or most referenced sages in the early texts. So he's speaking now to his mother. I will describe to you the characteristics of Sabja Yoga. By this practice, the mind becomes joyful, right? Sattvic, because in order to nirodha, the mind has to be sattvic. And we know from the Gita that one of the qualities of sattva is happiness. This is not the bliss of the Atman, it's not ananda, but it's sukham, and attains the truth, right? And notice here, Patanjali has the yamas and the niyamas. What do we find here? Well, it's a performance of duty to the best of one's capability, refraining from adharma, contentment with what is obtained by providence. There we have aparigraha of Patanjali, worshipping the feet of those who know the Atman. So we don't find this in Patanjali, this idea of sangha, of worshipping the sadhus, but we find it's very prominent in the Bhagavatam. Anyway, we don't have a lot of time, so we'll read on. Giving up mundane dharma, okay. An attraction to the dharma of liberation. Notice this is a dharma. The Bhagavatam starts off by saying, actually, the highest dharma is devotion to Bhagavan. All these other dharmas, they just pertain to the body and the mind. What about the dharma of the Atman? So there's this idea that there's a dharma of the Atman. Well, one dharma of the Atman is liberation of the Atman. The Bhagavatam would say that's secondary to the Dharma of Bhakti. But you know, we'll keep referring to that. Moderate intake of pure foodstuffs and living always in a solitary place, right? Patanjali would say, he doesn't mention solitude actually, but the Shveta does. The first reference to one of the earliest references to yoga is the Karta and the Shveta, and one or the other talks about, you know, the yogi meditating in a cave next to a river, etc. Right, here we have our yamas. One should practice non-violence, ahimsa, satya, ashteya, right? And instead of aparigraha, he uses yavat artha parigraha. Aparigraha means non-coveting, but here he's saying coveting only as much as is necessary, yavat artha. So you know, Patanjali schematizes. I mean, there were all kinds of yoga practitioners out there in the forests of ancient India, and there were all these variants, right? The Buddhas, early Buddhism has, you know, 10 dharanas, and we have Vishnu Purana speaks of 6 limbs. What Patanjali does is he systematizes it. And from that point on, pretty much Patanjali's schema becomes normative. But here we see, you know, similar things, but maybe the language is a bit different. One should practice celibacy, that's brahmacharya. And what else? Tapaha, shocha, svadhyaya, all of this. And instead of Ishvara pranidhana, he uses the term purusha archana. Archana is more of an active kind of worship, puja type worship. So observing silence, one should become fixed in sitting by mastering the appropriate asanas. So here we get a clearer sense of, well, what we find in yoga studios today, which is a variety of asanas. Patanjali just says stiram sukham asana, but actually, and it's important to note this, because people often say that all this asana being taught in yoga studios, there's, you know, no real classical reference to it. You know, they had to dig up these unknown texts like the Garanda Samhita and the Shiva Samhita, and even the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, nobody's ever heard of it. So that gets plucked out of obscurity. These texts get plucked out of obscurity because they have, you know, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika has, you know, 1 chapter on asana, but there's not much reference to asana in the class, in the Smriti, in the sort of normative pan-Indian texts. But actually, Vyas here, what happened there? Vyas, in his commentary on asana, he actually mentions 10 poses, and then he says, etc., which means there must be a lot more. He must have been aware of a lot more. If there was only like 12, he wouldn't have just listed 10 and then just said, etc., meaning the 2 he left out. There must have been a whole bunch. So I think sometimes, I don't know if enough attention is paid to that. Asana didn't gain the dignity of a literary tradition, other than these obscure texts that I just mentioned that nobody's ever heard of. And what do I mean by that? Nobody ever quotes them in their commentaries. That's how we know how established a text is with the commentaries of Vedanta or the Puranas or all of the commentaries. Or nobody's ever mentioned the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. So anyway, what does he say? So let's go back up here. So mastering the appropriate asanas here, notice the plural. You master them. So there was the practice of asana does go back into antiquity. It just never really got recorded, other than you know, in these sort of more marginal texts that pop up on the margins. So we could probably speculate that it didn't sort of have the intellectual dignity, at least in the intellectual traditions, that merited codification in a form that became normative. That doesn't mean that they weren't practiced, and it doesn't mean they weren't important, because you got to sit. But anyway, gradually mastering breath control. Instead of calling it pranayama, it calls it pranajaya, the jaya, the victory, the conquering of the breath. Practicing withdrawal of the senses, right? Pratyahara, with the mind fixed on the heart. The heart is the locus of the Atman since the Upanishads. One should fix the breath on one of the chakras. I think this is the only mention of chakra in the Bhagavatam. And there may be one other reference where it's called dhamma, but it's actually, it has nothing, it plays no role at all in the bhakti of the Bhagavatam, nor in Patanjali for that matter. I mean, there is a reference, I think, in one of the verses in chapter 3, one of the Siddhi verses to one of the chakras, but it's clearly, Patanjali is not a Kundalini method, and neither is the Bhagavatam. No mention of the Kundalini, which is of course, the central, the practice of the Siddha traditions to awaken Kundalini. But nonetheless, it does mention a chakra. So fix the breath on one of the chakras. Okay, one should contemplate the activities. Notice here, it's more of an active practice. If you're contemplating the activities, the chitta is vrittiing, but it's focused exclusively on Vishnu. So it's not quite a Nirodha practice. It's a very, very intensely fixed practice, but within that fixity on Vishnu, there is this scope for contemplating the activities. And that is the signature of the Bhagavatam. The activities of Bhagavan is really what the text is all about. And that blossoms in the 10th book, which makes the Bhagavatam by far the most important Purana. It has, almost 100 commentaries. And the next Purana is the Vishnu with 2. So you can probably quantify its importance also just looking at Indian art and drama and so forth in terms of themes. So what's important in the Bhagavatam is the activities of Bhagavan, the leelas, which of course take their, blossom in the 10th book of the text, which makes the Bhagavatam so popular. That's the story of Krishna. That's where we get the story of Krishna. We don't get it, it's there in the Padma and the Vishnu here and there, Harivamsa, but it's really the Bhagavata Purana that has by far been the most influential in terms of transmitting the story of Krishna. So, and that's the activities. And one becomes absorbed. Samadhana, we can recognize the root of samadhi. This is samadhi here, is absorbing the mind in the activities of Vishnu. It's a bhakti text. And by the way, almost all Indian meditation has been bhakti. And I venture to say Patanjali's as well, even though he's very, there's only there's 1,200 words in Patanjali. It's tiny. That's two pages. 12 font, double spaced. It's tiny. And people make all these inferences about what's not there mentioned there. My goodness, we have to see Patanjali in the context of the literary, landscape of his day, my friends. Otherwise, we just end up doing bad philology. So most yoga has been bhakti. And, the West, of course, can't generalize, but, the idea that bhakti means focusing on a form of Bhagavan. Bhakti is something that a bhakta does to Bhagavan. Bhakti is a verbal noun, and it has a subject and an object. Verbs have subjects and objects. So the bhakta is the subject who does bhakti, and the object is Bhagavan or Bhagavati. And Bhagavan and Bhagavati means Shiva and Vishnu and Narayana and Krishna and Devi and Durga and Kali. And, it's a big jump for many Westerners to have to sort of, to wrap their, we tend to think of these forms as mythological or symbolic when we apply some post-Freudian interpretation because that fits into our comfort zone. But we can do whatever we want. But we should be aware that nowhere in the 100,000 verse Mahabharata or 400,000 verses of the Purana does it ever say that these forms are mythological. Now, if we choose to see them that way, that's perfectly, that's our business, as long as we don't think that that's what the tradition says. The tradition takes that Isvara, to be complete, must have an infinity of forms, not non-material forms, Brahman forms, and all of the arguments that we find in Western intellectual circles against God, the notion of God with form, assume that a form is material and therefore limited and subject to the imperfections of materiality and made of parts and therefore blah, 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 usual arguments. the Indian tradition never said any, it always assumed that God's form must be sa-guna Brahman, made of Brahman, therefore not subject to the limitations, and that these forms are infinite. So the second reason why they're not subject to limitation, they can be infinite forms. But we're running out of time here. So when one has mastered asana, one should establish a seat where in a clean place, right? What does Patanjali say? No, the Upanishads say that. The Shveta talks about a clean place. Okay, clean place. And sitting comfortably, right? Stiram sukham, with stiram, Patanjali says, body erect, that's stiram. Now you begin practice a little bit. One should cleanse the passageway of air by performing the pura kumbhaka rechaka, right? The restraint and the exhalation. And you all know this. You're all well versed in these practices of pranayama, reverse, such that the chitta can become fixed, right? The beginning of meditation is with the breath, because there's an intimate relationship between prana and chitta. So when the prana slows down, the chitta slows down. The commentators say like when the queen bee settles down, well, so do all of the bees. So when the breath slows down, then the mind does. So the mind will soon be purified, just as iron, blah, 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 releases its impurities, right? By pranayama, one can burn imperfections. Patanjali says, what does he say? Pranayama, he says something about, okay, I forget. Getting old. But he says that pranayama, okay, well, it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
right,
the pranayama reveals the covering of light.
Yes,
so that the
avarana.
radiance.
Yes, he removes the covering, avarana, prakasha avaranam. So so what is it? So that means the sattva. What is the avarana? That would be rajas and tamas and the kleshas and so forth. So but essentially the same thing in different language. Now we see a bit of a difference here. But all of that so far could have been right out of the Yoga Sutras. Again, you gaze fixed on the top of the nose. Gita talks about this because if you close your eyes, you fall asleep. If you open them, you'll get distracted. So you basically cross your eyes and you look at the tip of the nose. And that would be the bottom of the nose. Or some people take it as between the eyebrows. You could take it there as well. I think the Gita says between the eye. So the tip could be the top of the nose or the tip of the nose. I think the Gita says it uses it twice. It mentions it twice. I think it's the eyebrow that it specifically mentions, between the brow, something like that. It doesn't matter, but here's where we're going now. Here's where we see the big difference, right? For Patanjali, Bhagavan comes, Isvara comes as Om. That's it. Om, impersonal. Seed. The personality doesn't emerge from that. But here one should meditate on the form of Bhagavan. So here's the meditation. This is what you chitta vritti nirodha on, Om being one option. And the Bhagavatam wouldn't reject that at all, but it's much more interested in this. His pleasing lotus-like features, reddish eyes like the interior of a lotus, dark like the petals of the blue lotus, bears a conch, discus, and club. And then we have this description, which is repeated again and again and again and again and again and again and again in the Bhagavatam. And you might say, why so repetitive? Well, my friends, because they didn't have books. So you're listening to this stuff and you have to hear it again and again and again. So you internalize it. So the samskaras of these descriptions are branded in your chitta, so that when you sit to meditate, you have all those details. You're so thoroughly familiar with them, having heard them again and again and again. He has a yellow dhoti. He's adorned by a magnificent necklace, bracelets. So branded in your chitta that when you sit to meditate, you can summon up that form. You create a deity made of samskara. Deities can be made of sound, like Om, right? Tasyavachaka. Can be made of 9 different substances, the Bhagavatam says, and probably many more. Can be made of stone, like the deities of marble in the temple, and so forth. But one can be the deity in your mind made of samskaras. And on with the description. His hips are adorned with brilliantly shining girdle, His countenance is serene. And so you're actually meditating on what Bhaktas would say, is the form of God, sa-guna Brahman, eternally gorgeous to behold. This is not an Advaita text. In Advaita, you meditate, Advaita Vedanta, you meditate on Bhagavan. But ultimately, when you attain success in Advaita Vedanta, then Bhagavan dissolves, everything dissolves, sarvamidam kalu Brahman, everything, the notions of creation, all of that becomes seen as a superimposition. And all that remains then is Brahman. So even Bhagavan, so even though Advaita Vedantins might use bhakti practice, certainly do use bhakti practices, in that tradition, the goal is same as Patanjali, Svarupa Vastana, and except the Sva in Advaita Vedanta then becomes the universal, no longer a Sva, but the experience is the same, infinite, eternal experience of Satchidananda. Although Patanjali doesn't speak of Ananda, we have no reason to suppose, well, I don't know. Sankhya actually does say there is no Ananda. They would prefer to say that when they talk about Ananda, what they're really referring to is absence of dukkha, suffering. So Sankhya speaks of Sat and Chit. Vedanta adds the Ananda, from the Brihadaranyaka and so forth. Anyway, let's not get too sidetracked. So here we are. So all of this description and then not just contemplating the form of God, but the activities. The activities of the Lord are always attractive. Okay, therefore, with the mind full of pure love, this is what tadartha bhavanam means in the Bhagavatam. What does it mean to japa tadartha bhavanam? You do japa, you focus the mind on Isvara as sonic presence in pranava, in Om. What does tadartha bhavanam mean? This. You fix it, but with love, knowing what it represents, your beloved Bhagavan. And there's no doubt that, in my mind, that anyone who accepted Ishwar in Patanjali's day and age would have been either a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite, possibly a Krishnaite, but that's what it meant to be a theist. There's no other options. So we can't extract Patanjali from the context of his time as if he exists in some kind of isolated bubble, my friend. That's bad scholarship. We have to situate Patanjali in his landscape. That Ishvara meant Shaiva from the time of the Shvetashvataras centuries earlier. Shaiva, Vaishnava, Narayana, and so forth. Okay? Right. Now, and then I got to go into Dhruva to make a contrast. So then there's a detailed visualization of each of Bhagavan's limbs, so that the practice here, the Nirodha practice, is absorbing the mind in the form, right, starting with the feet and then up through the various limbs. And finally, a person at this point with heart flowing with love for the Lord, Hari, Bhagavan, with hair standing on end from ecstasy. This is the Ananda of Bhakti. And constantly overwhelmed with streams of tears from intense love, gradually withdraws the hook of the chitta. So now the practice is sort of transitioning from Sabija to nir-bija. The mind, the Ishvara here has been a hook to focus the mind. But now at this stage, the mind suddenly attains liberation, nirvana. By the way, that was a common term that everybody used. In the Gita, it's used twice. Doesn't mean it was borrowed from Buddhism, my friends. It just means it was a common term that everybody used. Eventually, it becomes associated with Buddhism, and the Hindu Jaina tradition stopped using it. Just like Kaivalya, Patanjali uses it. Eventually, it becomes associated with Jainism, and the Hindus stopped using it, and they use terms like moksha instead. But in the beginning, there's a common pool of vocabulary. So even in the Bhagavatam. So, and enters the state of freedom, detached without objects, right? This is nir-bija, no objects. Like the flame of a lamp when it's extinguished. Notice this, this is how nirvana is described by Buddhists. Extinguishment of a lamp. Freed from the flow of the gunas, one now perceives the Atman fully manifest and autonomous. The yogi is a result of this supreme dissolution of the mind, right? This is what Chitta Vritti Nirodha means. The mind dissolves. It doesn't metaphysically dissolve, but it ceases to be an object of awareness. lots of questions, of course, can be posed here, but let's just understand the system. And then it goes on. So beautiful verses. But I want to go a bit. Are we gonna stop at 11:30, Professor Chappell, or do you want to give me an extra few minutes?
Oh, please take a little bit more time.
Okay, how much is a little bit?
Well, we're still good, so another 10 or 15, I think, will be fine. And we do want to leave a little bit for questions after that.
Okay. I just love this verse here. Let's just read verse 37. The highest yogi who has realized his or her true nature, right, the Swarupa of Patanjali, as Atman, is not aware of whether the body is sitting or standing, or whether by chance it has reached somewhere, or else departed under the control of fate. Just like one who is blinded by intoxication is not aware of whether one is covered by clothing or not. So that's fairly common for the yoga traditions, this kind of description. Okay, so the point here is then this type of bhakti overlaps with Patanjali insofar as the goal is an experience of the Atman. But the Bhagavatam has another goal of bhakti, which might include, you might pick up the Atman on the way, like you pick up an MA or an MPhil on the way to a PhD, but you don't get off the train at the MA, at the Atman. You keep going, because there's a supreme Atman beyond your Atman. And if you're immersed in your own Atman, remember, you're not aware of anything else. Well, what if even Patanjali, Isvara remains? Even if you're in a Swarupa Vastanam state, even Patanjali with his 20 words on Isvara, he is the eternal guru of the ancients, eternally there. But if you're in your Swarupa Vastanam, then you're not aware. Just as you're not aware of the world or of the mind, you're also not aware of Isvara, but he remains there even in Patanjali. So if we start pushing these few little phrases, the few little descriptors that we find in Patanjali, we end up with a lot of question marks. Where is this Isvara, who is eternal, supremely omniscient, never affected by kleshas, never been in samsara? If he's the guru of the ancients and he's the guru of the future as well, he's eternal after all, Purushas are eternal. But where does he exist? In what realm, what dimension? And of course, then the Puranas then flesh out these kinds of questions, and they speak that Brahman has a nir-guna, sa-guna, that Brahman has an impersonal sort of aspect to it and a personal aspect. Now, depending on the sects, Shankara would say, well, yes, but the impersonal is higher, and the personal is ultimately all superimposed illusion. That would be a Advaita position, but the Vaishnava traditions and certain Shaiva Siddhanta traditions, not Kashmir Shaivism, that's another story for another day. They would say, no, these forms are eternal and they're supreme. We're just reading a text now in our course at Rutgers called the Chaitanya Charitamrita, 16th century text on Chaitanya's, great saint of India, who sort of spearheaded this sort of Krishna revival in North India. And the author of the text outlines that the nir-guna Brahman is nothing other than the effulgence of the body of Bhagavan. And one can be absorbed in the effulgence without knowing anything about the source of the effulgence. So that's the position of the Vaishnavas. Vaishnavas meaning the Guruji Iyengar tradition, the Krishnamacharya tradition, if you want to connect it to Main Street Yoga. Krishnamacharya, staunch Sri Vaishnava, immensely learned, was actually offered the opportunity of taking over the principal mart, the sort of headquarters of that whole lineage. Most traditions in India are Vaishnavism is you have Madhvas, Ramanujas, Ramananda. Its extent in India is not matched by its presence in the West. These traditions haven't really been exported in the same way as the Neo-Advaita traditions have been. But let's now go to Dhruva. So first of all, the mantra is Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya that he's given by his Guru Narad. So we get the Om, but Om is like a seed in these traditions, Shaiva and Vaishnava and Devi traditions. So what happens when you plant a seed? Seed doesn't really tell you much about, you have to plant it and then, a fruit will come or a tree will come with leaves and flowers and so forth. So for the personalist traditions, Om manifests although a seed, it manifests its full presence in the forms of Devi and Shiva and Krishna. And therefore the mantras of each of these traditions, that seed then manifests, in this case of the Bhagavatam, its presence as Vasudeva, which is Krishna. But you'll see the same thing in the Shaiva Purana, it's Om Namo Shivaya. So that's the mantra in the sort of more intensely devotional traditions. So reciting this mantra, okay, and then we don't have much time, so here you do pujas, this, right. So now Dhruva is going to do this, we're focusing on the Ashtanga practices. So he goes off to the forest. It's a lovely little story, and his motive is not to seek the Atman. He's seeking wealth greater than his father. The Gita says we mentioned the Gita says 4 types of people seek me. Well, one of them is seeking wealth, but Dhruva is seeking wealth. So what does he do? He takes a bath, fasted, and then, right, this is tapas, the first word of the 2nd chapter. What do you do? What do you do if you want to be a yogi? Right? You think, okay, Patanjali, very nice, Chittavritti Nirodha sounds like a good proposal. What do you do? Kriya, what am I going to do? First thing you do, my friends, chapter 2, first word, tapaha. Right? And we tend to avoid that bit. Say, oh, hang on, we'll edit that. We'll edit that one out. But tapaha, there's no yoga without tapaha, my friends, without sense control. But anyway, here we go. What about his tapaha? Obviously, it's exaggerated to give us, well, maybe not obviously, but anyway, to give us a sense of how intense this practice is. If we really want to attain that goal, rather than just being hippy-dippy yogis, then look what he's doing. 1 month eating only wood apple and jujuba fruits every 3 nights. That's the first month. That's how he kicks off with that. Eats every 3 days, whatever the wood apple is, and jujuba sounds kind of bitter, forest fruits. 2nd month, every 6 days he only leaves and grass. 3rd month, he only didn't eat anything, water every 9 days, right? So just giving us a sense of what, we still find yogis in India today undertaking incredible tapas. Maybe not quite like, obviously not quite like this, but still. Right, 4th month, air every 12 days. That's it. 5th month. Anyway, we'll go on, and he's standing on one leg, Ekapada Hastasana. So let's just jump to eventually Vishnu appears. Okay, so because he's disrupting the universe, his micro state of the fourth pranayama that Patanjali says we stop breathing altogether. He masters that. But his micro world inside his mind spills out into the macro world of the whole universe, and the whole universe becomes asphyxiated. So then the celestials go to Vishnu and say, look, we're all running, we can't breathe, there's no oxygen. This is 5-year-old kids doing Ekapada Hastasana, do something, right? So Vishnu comes down on his eagle carrier, and in his little, he wants to see Dhruva. Now, here's the point. Vishnu, on account of the intensity of Dhruva's mature yoga practice, appeared in the lotus of Dhruva's heart, effulgent as lightning. So the goal, the teaching here is that there's another goal, not just the experience of your own Atman. You can have a vision of Bhagavan, and that's what the bhaktas seek. They're not interested in just being immersed in their own Svarupa. They would find that rather boring, actually. All eternity just in the state of infinite, eternal, no identity, no personality, just no mind, no senses, no nothing, just an infinite, fine, blissful, certainly not suffering, but the Bhagavata rejects it. its main role models are yogis that come out of that state in order to seek a higher, more blissful kind of relationship with Bhagavan, which they consider to be infinitely more blissful and more and so forth. Okay, so, and here's an example of that. So he appears in the mind of Dhruva. In other words, the samskaras of the form that Dhruva is concentrating on, a form made of samskaras at a certain point, the samskaras dissolve and the actual form manifests in the mind. So that's one goal of devotional meditation. Certainly the Vaishnava traditions, but the Vaishnava tradition, other traditions as well. The goal is a vision of God, a darshana. So what that can occur in the mind. So then Vishnu suddenly disappeared. Opening his eyes, Dhruva saw him standing outside in the same position. So that darshana can occur in the mind, or it can occur external to the mind. So these are the two ways that Bhagavan, then Isvara, and if you seek Isvara, Isvara will appear, can appear. If you seek the Atman, then you seek the Atman, and Isvara can give you that. Okay, like Patanjali, Samadhi Siddhir Isvara Pranidhanat. So the Bhagavatam accepts both as bona fide, noble, worthy pursuits, but consistently minimizes the, and I'll conclude with these words, consistently minimizes the value of the Svarupa Vastanam of Patanjali, of Atmanam Atmane Atmana, as Gita puts it, the Atman be absorbed in the Atman, through the Atman, by the Atman, consistently minimizes that experience in contrast to an actual vision of God and ultimately relationship with God, which of course the 10th book then becomes so famous for illustrating what kinds of relationships can one have with Bhagavan in this world, and then eternally in the sort of personal realms within Brahman, known as Vaikuntha and Goloka. Okay, so there are Shiva, certainly Shiva Siddhanta overlaps with this quite a bit. Kashmir Shaivism we don't have enough time to talk about. But I think a common denominator of Bhakti is an intense focus on a form of Bhagavan or Bhagavati, although what the goal of that type of meditation is varies between schools. For some, the goal is an eternal relationship with an eternally distinct God. That would be Vaishnavism, Shaiva Siddhanta. For others, it is you actually become that. You become God, Shivoham, as in Kashmiri Shaivism. For others, all this notion of God is illusory ultimately, and everything sort of dissolves into just an all-pervading, infinite Brahman, qualityless, formless. So the goals vary. And if we want to respect the traditions, and not, what are our options when you have all these different goals? Or you can say one is right, the rest are wrong. You can say they're all wrong, they're all mental constructs. Okay, that would be a sort of academic reductionistic way of thinking about it. Or you could say one is right, one is wrong. Or you could try to say something like they're all leading to the same place, but that's not what they're saying. They're not saying that. That's just a sort of a neo, well, we want, that's not what the traditions are saying, that they're leading to the same place. I rather like the Jain idea of Satvad, where they're all true. Of course, Jains are going to hierarchize it and say, well, they're all true, but but the Jains are more true than everybody else, like Animal Farm, right? I think we really need to embrace, my friends, we need to reject the idea that the ultimate goal is monolithic, one size fits all. Who said that? If there's variegatedness in this world that we perceive, why should not the ultimate divine state be variegated? So there are monotheistic possibilities, there are Shiva-related possibilities. There are, Pratitya Samutpada, Buddhist enlightened states. Let them all be true in exactly the manner they claim to be true. Let us respect the virtuosi of those traditions and what they claim and the theologies that they compose. Let them all be true and let them all coexist, and therefore let us pay attention to the path that we seek. And just before we sign our contracts, let us see what the options are and decide very clearly, what path we're going to take, because they don't all lead to the same place. They don't claim to lead to the same place. They debate each other for centuries and centuries and centuries. So who the heck are we in our hippy dippy post 60s hold hand ommy wommy kind of culture to say that they're all the same? They're not all the same, and that's a wonderful thing. And let us choose wisely. Let us do our svadhyaya, and let us make informed decisions and respect what the traditions say about themselves. And with that, hopefully I've given a little bit of a glimpse of what a bhakti practice looks like, at least the Ashtanga version of it. That's not actually the main bhakti practice. Bhakti practice tends to be much more kind of puja, worship, and more of an active type of practice. But nonetheless, there are Ashtanga versions that completely overlap with Patanjali, but with a much, much, much richer and Isvara presence. So
excellent. And I'd like to affirm that within the Vaishnava tradition, of course, there are 10 avatars. So there's story upon story after story, and that this multiplicity speaks to our desire to recognize difference and to celebrate in ever so many ways. And your presentation, I think, has done an excellent job of calling this to our attention. So for the next maybe 10 minutes, I'd like to invite any comments or questions. And I see Giri tuned in. So I'm wondering, Giri, if we could get a little of your wisdom.
Oh, wow. That's a big call out. Yeah, I love the presentation. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did like the mention that Patanjali has to be interpreted within the literary and the literary milieu with which he emerged from. It's kind of an important point that you made there. Because if we're taking Patanjali outside of that context, then we're essentially sort of appropriating it in ways that kind of fit what we want them to. So by looking at that cultural, textual, religious milieu from which Patanjali comes, we get to understand Isvara. So you make a very great and bold point that, there is a tradition of Isvara that exists in Patanjali's time. There's multiple perspectives on Isvara. There's multiple texts that weren't necessarily centering asana, they were centering bhakti. And those texts had well-defined understandings of who or what Isvara was. You've got Shaiva traditions and Vaishnava traditions with which Patanjali was likely drawing from and absolutely aware of. So I think you gave an excellent idea there in the sense that we can look at Patanjali's concept of Isvara and fill it in with these other texts and provide like a lot more of a rich understanding of Isvara in that context. Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that completely and utterly. Everything you said, yes. And I think it's a bit irresponsible. I think, this is just me now, so don't take this too seriously. my personal feeling is people try to wriggle out of the implication because they're like a nice rational, almost secular Patanjali, there's a certain discomfort with all of these forms that come down from the colonial period. That where of course the forms, the early period were considered satanic, right? But mythological, if one is being polite, they're considered mythological and so forth. So I think there's a discomfort. We don't quite know what to do with the notion of God with form, because it goes against sort of biblical and Greco, actually, Aristotle and Plato, which gets absorbed into Christianity. And so I think there's a kind of samskaric clash there. And that to me is one of the reasons why there is this impulse to sort of sterilize Patanjali's Isvara. It's a discomfort with the reality of what Isvara is, since the Shvetashvatara, which Isvara is Shiva in your face, Vishnu in your face, Krishna. You can't get more in your face than Krishna in the Gita, right? I am God, I am Bhagavan, and so forth. Yeah. So that's just my personal sense of it. But yes, thank you for your comments, Giri. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Stoma, if you might be able to just share a little perspective. And Stoma is a longtime friend of our work at LMU.
The thought that came to mind is Swami Veda's statement based on the dictum ekam sat from the Veda, that there's no such thing as polytheism in Hinduism. It's polymorphous monotheism.
Yeah, exactly that. Yes.
And right, we have a struggle with form, but it's so wonderful because he always used to say, God is a mother. If the baby says, "Mommy, put on the blue dress," she puts on the blue dress.
Yeah.
If the baby says, "Mommy, be Vishnu," Mommy will be Vishnu.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
and of course these traditions will, some of them will understand it that way, and others will understand the forms to be eternal forms. It's
right.
not that there's some absolute over and above the forms that then puts on, the masks of God, as Campbell would have put it. But these are eternal, infinite forms. But yeah, they're infinite. They have to be, because if God is infinite and a form is not to be a limitation, number one, it can't be material, and number two, there must be an infinity of forms.
Right.
And that's
and it's also been interesting to me that if you look at the sort of masculine figured forms of divinity, they tend to be more discrete and crystallized, whereas Mother is always shifting from one form to another all the time. It's much more fluid.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Form-wise.
Very interesting.
Particularly in texts like Chandi.
Yes, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'm less familiar with those texts, but that sounds right. Yeah. I wonder what that means, but we can think about that. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, Judith, could you just give a reflection and a thought?
I attend a lot of Dr. Bryant's classes, and I really do like the consideration of Isvara that he brings to us, asking which Isvara is this? The idea, let's see, it's very late here. See if I can put this together. The idea that the question that we ask often, which Isvara is being considered? Is this the Isvara of creation? Is this a different Isvara that, and that Patanjali, I think, is curious, doesn't pursue the question, because it's not really what the text of the Yoga Sutras is about.
Sure.
And so there isn't a denial that Isvara is Isvara of creation. It's just not central to this particular project. So
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really.
The term Isvara, when we use the term Isvara, in philosophical discourse, it means the creator God. So even if you're debating with, let's say, nir-Ishvaravadins, like Buddhists and Jains, what you're arguing against is the need for a creator God. So, but nobody denies the meaning of the word Ishvara, which is the creator, and even the word itself, Ish is to have power, and so Ishvara is the being with the most power, and the most powerful thing you can do is create. So we have to assume that we have no, unless we have some reason to think otherwise, we have to assume that Patanjali is using the term in the same way everybody else is using it, and it's the creator God. Now Bhagavan is slightly different, because Bhagavan at that point, Bhaga means quality. So then, whereas Ishvara just refers to, it's a placeholder for creator, when we use the term Bhagavan, we're referring to qualities, the possessor of qualities. So at that point, Bhagavan is used for Shiva and for Krishna when their qualities, the form, the colors, their attire, their leelas, their activities is being referred to. But anyway, your point is good. Yes, Ishvara is definitely understood as creator, and to say that Patanjali's Ishvara is not a creator because in the 20 words that he uses, he doesn't mention creation is a very strange argument, because he's not talking about, just as you said, he's talking about Chitta Vritti Nirodha, and his interest in Ishvara is only related to that. He comes as japa, you nirodha the mind on japa, and samadhi, sit here and he can give you samadhi. He's not talking about creation. So that's an excellent point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think we'll draw this to a close. I know it's so very late for those of you on the East Coast, and I really appreciate that you stayed up, Edwin, because I know I'm an early to bed person, and that's sort of the yoga way. And I wanted to just end with a couple of reflections on being in India. I was there on a Fulbright in 2019. And we were in Maharashtra during Ganesh Puja, and the streets are filled with pop-up altars, quite some magnificent, colorful, lots of activities, lots of aritis, all time of the day and night. And then during Navratri, the veneration of the goddess again and again. And we were living by that time in Delhi, and there's a neighborhood where the Bengalis live, and it was mini Calcutta with these giant images of Durga being paraded through the streets, being venerated. And then Diwali, and everybody loves Diwali. Every tradition, Christian, Muslim, Vaishnava, Shaiva, Jaina, everybody has a reason to celebrate the light and the arrival of the light. And this is the holiday, like Christmas in the Christian world, where everybody goes home, everybody exchanges gifts. And there's just this rhythm of exuberant appreciation of form that is such the hallmark of the culture, and so much the experience of any individual dwelling within India. And as we know, those categories of Sankhya, several lifted up tonight by Edwin, are shared in common by us all. We love sweet fragrance, we love tasty foods, we love color, we love the sound of beautiful music. And what Bhakti does, regardless of the rupa, is that Bhakti allows us to feel a taste of that swarupa within us. And I really appreciate, as strange, I mean, 20 years ago, who could have predicted that these screens would be lighted up with people from all over the world? And on the one hand, I just want to reach out and touch everybody. You know, it's a little bit corny, but but nonetheless, here we do what we can. And I want to thank Edwin for beaming in, quite literally, all the way from New Jersey, and the rest of you from around the continent and around the world. So have a wonderful evening, and look forward to seeing you next time. We will hear from Lorelei Bernacki in the month of April, the month of March, and then in the month of April, we'll hear from Staneshwar Timal Sinha. So more to come, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Excellent.
Namaste.
Good night, everybody. And how about a Jai Shri Radhe
Jai Shri
Shyam?
Radhe Jai.
Thank you so much, Professor Chappell.
Thank you,
And
Edwin.
thank you for all your good work. Really putting yoga on the map in academically and in a respectable, highly respectable academic manner, and giving folks a chance to get their MAs, right? You don't have a PhD.
Not
MA
yet.
in
Soon,
which you're
soon
working
we
on it.
hope.
And
Yeah.
I'll send you lots of good students. Well, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.